Is not man's life on earth drudgery? Who of us have not considered this question in some form? A question posed to us in our first reading by Job. When our relationships, classes, or careers don't go according to plan, we have a tendency from time to time to panic. Now, admittedly, it's never fun when things backfire, but like many things in life, it all depends how we look on them. It's the old saying, is your glass half full or is it half empty? Is it partly cloudy or partly sunny in your world? Regardless, when these circumstances and situations arise, how we end up looking at it makes all the difference. This past week, I had the privilege of reading an essay written by Dr. Martin Luther King. He wrote it in 1966, and it speaks in a particular way on the importance of nonviolence. The title of the essay is Nonviolence, the Only Road to Freedom. In this essay, Dr. King makes the case that the nonviolent approach to the civil rights movement was going to be critical, no matter the circumstances they faced, because if they got into a battle of words, if it was a back and forth, it could easily spiral into merely two angry groups of people duking it out. So Dr. King was adamant about the fact that in all instances, this movement should maintain the moral high ground. Why? Because then it would ultimately allow the conversation to be focused on human rights and the integrity therein. Dr. King had lived this himself, of course, and we know ultimately, just 2 years later after this essay, he himself was assassinated in 1968. But as he concluded this particular essay, he reminds us that in 1955, his own home had been bombed, and the people surrounding him encouraged him to enhance his security. And once again, he said, listen, if we make it about my own personal safety, then again, this conversation, which is much broader than myself, begins to focus on me in a way that doesn't allow us to think about we. So when he begins to project what ultimately it will take for this movement to succeed, he writes the following, and I'm going to read it, and I think it's worthy of our consideration. He says the following: "There is no easy way to create a world where men and women can live together, where each has his own job and house, and where all children receive as much education as their minds can absorb. But if such a world is created in our lifetime, it will be done in the United States by people of goodwill. It will be accomplished by persons who have the courage to put an end to suffering by willingly suffering themselves rather than inflict suffering upon others. It will be done by rejecting the racism, materialism, and violence that has characterized Western civilization, and especially by working toward a world of cooperation and peace." So why highlight Dr. King in the context of these readings? Is it to make us somehow feel better that at least in our circumstances, our homes have not been bombed? Well, certainly there's a real reality and worthy topic of reflection and consideration in our own lives, that certainly there are people in the world who have things far more difficult than we ourselves oftentimes experience. But that is actually not the reason that I've highlighted Dr. King. The reason is because Dr. King and St. Paul from our second reading and Jesus in our gospel all highlight a characteristic that, frankly, Job fails to present. Let's look back on Job's text. Job is focused on his personal circumstance. He even finishes with a rather sad and, one might say, self-pitying flourish. "Remember that my life is like the wind. I shall not see happiness again." Job is so utterly focused on what has not worked out, and for good reason. Go back and read the book of Job. Things were not necessarily in his favor in that particular time or moment. But yet his focus was not on all the good that God had done for him in previous moments in this text. It was these are really difficult days. But meanwhile, by comparison, Dr. King, who had experienced untold amounts of racism and targeted attacks in his own life, finishes his essay with an optimistic tone, with a belief and a certainty that in time, people will come together, that we will understand that it is through cooperation and peace. It is by willingly accepting the suffering of our own lives so that we might be able to alleviate the suffering of others, that this movement would begin to take root and flourish. And when I consider the difference between the two, one is focused on self and the other is focused on the whole. One is focused on what is not going right in this moment, and the other continues to believe, as Dr. King once said, that I have a dream that something else is more possible, that if we come together, something more profound is made manifest. And here's the beauty. St. Paul wholly and entirely agrees. From St. Paul to the Corinthians, although I am free in regard to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so as to win over as many as possible. To the weak I became weak, to win over the weak. I have become all things to all, to save at least some. All this I do for the sake of the gospel, so that I too may have a share in it. St. Paul, my brothers and sisters, invited the people of Corinth and invites us today to consider how we might see our struggle not as unfortunate events and to be pulled down into the pit of despair, but instead to recognize it as an opportunity to preach the joy of the gospel. To see, just as Jesus did, that the crucifix is not the end. His death was not the end. It was the beginning of new life. There was something yet to come, that God could transform all things. St. Paul was rooted in that belief. Dr. King was rooted in that belief. This belief, my brothers and sisters, is not foreign to us. It is by its very nature at the heart of our faith. It is why we gather in this moment. It is why we gather in this basilica, to come together not as perfect people, but as people who are burdened in different ways, but yet at the same time we continue to have hope. We continue to allow it to overcome that which we encounter as difficult with the belief that it can be transformed. St. Paul says it so well. If I preach the gospel, there is no reason for me to boast, for an obligation has been imposed on me, and woe to me if I do not preach it. St. Paul knew in the fiber of his being that every day, every moment of every day was an invitation to preach the gospel. But I do want to say this. There's an element of Job and his humanity that all of us should connect with. Because there's times when, frankly, we just lose sight of the truth. We just lose sight of the gift that is staring us in the face. And for those moments, I wonder how we might consider what could come of it. And so let's look at this gospel. Let's look at what had happened. Jesus had had a rather full day. He had healed St. Peter's mother-in-law, and then seemingly spent the rest of the day preaching, healing, proclaiming this good news, a good news that we meditate on this day. And at the end of it, what did he do? You'd think that he would think to himself, maybe tomorrow morning I should just sleep in. It's been a long, hard day. But what do we hear in this gospel? Rising very early before dawn, he went off to a deserted place where he prayed. The role of prayer, my brothers and sisters, I think is critical in all of this. There are times in our lives where we can focus on the action. If I'm not careful, the takeaway of this homily is just go out and do more things. But that's not the primary point. The primary point is to find ways to remain rooted in the gift of our faith. To find ways to connect with the God who heals, the God who provides, the God who gives us the grace necessary to take the next faithful step. It's a question for us to ponder. What is the role of prayer in our lives? How, in the midst of the ups and the downs and the in-betweens, do we make time for it? Is there ever a time when we're walking across campus where we take the buds out of our ears? Perhaps we give ourselves a chance to once again reacquaint ourselves with the different texture and tone and feelings of this campus, to see the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue, the large statue of Mary on the dome. All of these signs and symbols that are reminders. When's the last time when passing by the basilica we just swung in for 5 minutes of prayer? Or maybe if you're commuting, when's the last time you turned off the radio or that podcast and just gave yourself a moment to be present, to allow the Lord to speak a word of hope? You see, Jesus made time for this prayer. We need to make time for this prayer. If we are to allow this faith to take root in us, if we are to allow this faith to continue to nourish us, we must make time for it. I'll be the first one to admit, there have been times in my life where I get overwhelmed by my responsibilities, that I become undisciplined in my habits around prayer, and I'm always led to the following belief: I'm going to have to handle this all by myself. And I'm here to tell you that moment, those moments, are just simply not true. We need in those moments to remind ourselves. It needs to serve as an alarm in our minds. Like when we begin to get down that logic, like I have to do this all by myself, then we have to step back and ask ourselves, what is the Lord inviting me to consider? Is this the only way? And the answer is no. The answer is definitively no. The other thought that sometimes comes across our minds is, well, I'm too far gone. This is just the way that I am. And I want to once again say to you, that couldn't be farther from the truth. One of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes of all times is the following: if you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the one who turns back the soonest is the most progressive. All we need is to realize where we find ourselves and then to begin to move in the direction of the Lord. All we need to do is to leave just a crack open for the Holy Spirit, for God's grace to come pouring in, to allow it to begin to transform our lives. After Jesus' prayer, after that time of prayer, what does he say to his disciples? He told them, "Let us go to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose have I come." Jesus continues to desire to share this word. That is absolutely the case for us. We need to see ourselves as people who are waiting to hear his word, opening our hearts and our minds to that which is to come. How do we allow for it? How do we create little moments in our day so that we can hear it, so that we can be motivated by it? The simple fact is this: at the end of this Mass, we will head out these doors. And largely, we will head back into the difficult, the mundane, the challenging aspects of our lives. There's just no two ways about it. That's what it means to be human beings. But what it also means to be people of faith is that we don't do it alone. We carry the mark of Christ, and we live the virtues of faith, hope, and love. May the Lord continue to bless us on this journey. May we never lose hope, and may we always be mindful that the vision that Jesus proclaimed is the vision that is placed on our hearts and our minds, and it is that vision that we carry forth this day.